I'm joining you from far and distant Lima, Peru, in the so-called Global South, so I'm especially happy to be here. And I'll be talking to you about policy cycles, immigration and asylum policy cycles in Latin America. And I want to do two things in 15 minutes. I want to give you a good idea about these policy cycles, why they're different, why they matter for migration theory. And I want to talk to you and ask you, because I still have this question, how far it's useful to look at policy cycles and compare them within countries and across countries, and not only do that in massive monographs, but do that in academic papers. So let's see what we've got. We're at IMI, so I'm presenting some demic data on overall policy shifts towards restrictiveness. And what we see here is that Latin America really is net normality and has been since the 1940s, and then especially since the 1970s, with the democratization of the region, there has been this clear overall, and as problematic as this is, overall shift towards policy liberalization in Latin America, whereas we see a restrictive shift in virtually all other regions, major Western destinations, and other regions including Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and the Eastern Bloc. So I'm interested in two things. I want to ask, is there really this liberal paradigm shift in Latin America? And as all our research is limited, the demic database is limited as it only looks at Argentina, Brazil, Chile, and Mexico. I want to ask what explains this policy shift. And I want to look at its impact. So I want to look at policy output, implementation, outcome, and how the outcome feeds back into the policy-making process, which would be the entire policy cycle I come to in a second. It's really important, first of all, to understand what the policy cycle is, and there has been quite a bit of academic debate in political science about its usefulness. I want to make very clear that the policy cycle is no theoretical model. It's really, I would describe it as a heuristic template to understand messy empirical processes and to organize our research, and to organize our research on the interrelationship between policy outputs and outcomes, and I'll come to it in a second. So it's this ideal typical template of the policy-making process, starting with the agenda setting process, policy formulation, decision-making, policy implementation, and then eventually monitoring, evaluation, and either the continuation of policies or its reversal. And I think this template has rightly been criticized as not being very realistic, and this rather being the real world, right? These policy stages do not always happen. They don't always happen in a consecutive manner. And of course, there are many different actors that influence, sorry, and I should give the source, that influence the policy making process. Nevertheless, I have found in my research, I like to imagine ourselves as researchers being photographers with the zoom lens, right? And the question is, how far do we zoom in and zoom out? And I think there's a problem with our research that we sometimes zoom in and focus too much on just one stage of the policy cycle. And we do that in order to prove causality, right, within one of these stages, but sometimes we lose the bigger picture. So what I would like to discuss with you is in how far we can zoom out and still focus and do both. Important definitions, policy outputs, formal regulations, laws, decrees, in my case on immigration and asylum. Policy implementation, pretty straightforward. Policy outcome is the difference that the policy output makes. And from the recent literature review I did once more in recent weeks, we're not all clear on this. And we have to be really specific on this. Policy outcomes can also be intended and unintended consequences. And as a matter of fact, very often policy has unintended consequences that then defines whether a policy is continued or not. There's also some overlap between implementation and outcomes sometimes, but I won't go into detail there. What's important is that there is a relationship between policy outputs, so between the laws and their implementation, outcomes in the case of immigration and asylum, that would probably be asylum application rates and migrant stocks, and then the reverse relationship between those outcomes and the continuation or reversal of policies. So, is there a regional trend, a recent regional trend in immigration and asylum policy liberalization in the region? This is basically a list of all the recent laws in the field of migration and asylum in Latin America. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but basically there have been a lot of reforms, and there is a clear trend towards liberalization. All the numbers you see in yellow and in green are either fairly or very liberal. So we see this very clear trend within refugee legislation, which I've coded for all 90 Latin American countries. And then in immigration laws, we sort of see a divide. We have a number of countries that are still rather restrictive and securitized in their outlook, more than anything in Central America. And then we have a clear shift towards liberalization, more than anything in the Southern Cone. Another thing we see here that there is not a lot of time difference between reforms in immigration and asylum laws. So this is just two maps to show how green or red the region is. The light green are countries which will pass more liberal laws either this or next year. Green, very liberal. Red, rather restrictive. Yellow, fairly liberal in the case of refugee laws. So, very briefly, what do I mean when I talk about liberalization, when I say there is liberalization? One of the maybe most outstanding things, and Stephen still called it utopian yesterday, the right to migrate. There are various legislations in Latin America that stipulate a human right to migrate. Argentina, Bolivia, Uruguay, and Ecuador. Other important pillars are the non-criminalization of migrants, the stipulation of regularization programs for irregular migrants, and as like a background ideology, or you find it in many legislations, the idea of regional integration, and eventually also the idea of South American citizenship. In the area of asylum, we have very expensive refugee definitions. Latin America has its own refugee definition that comes from the Cartagena Declaration of 1984, which does not only recognize refugees who flee from persecution based on race, race, religion, nationality, social group, and political opinions, as stipulates the UN Convention, but also generalized violence, which in the context of the Central American crisis right now is very important. These laws are also expansive when it comes to complementary protection, specification of grounds for protection, and something that Tim mentioned yesterday. Argentina, for example, allows refugees to file asylum claims in their embassies abroad. So you don't necessarily have to reach Latin America before you're able to file asylum. Very briefly, what I find is that there is overlap between the two policy cycles in the area of immigration and asylum, that very often once there has been an impetus for policy reform in one area that also leads to reform in the other, and these processes go both ways in different countries. So it's not always that immigration reform came first or asylum reform, but they're closely interlinked and interrelated. So what are the causes of this policy liberalization? And here what I did is I went back to the first stage of the policy cycle, agenda setting. Discourses. In Korea, we just heard you don't talk about migration. Latin American politicians really like to talk about migration. And in their discourses, what's interesting, even more progressive and more liberal than in their laws. So they talk about the fact that there are no illegal citizens, there are only practices that violate the rights of persons, such as a quote by Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa in 2008. And we also have Argentina's ex-president Cristina Kirchner and Bolivia's Morales, who really spin or construct these migration analogies with former European migration to Latin America, and they now compare this to more recent regional immigration and even to immigration from Africa and Asia. So very, very positive liberal discourses. What explains that? we can talk about it later maybe. Just want to point it out. In the literature, there seems to be agreement that discursive gaps between what politicians say and the laws they pass are always in the direction of laws being less restrictive, or the other way around, discourses being more restrictive than the laws. In Latin America, we see the opposite thing. Discourses are even more liberal than the laws that are being passed. Public opinion doesn't really explain this. Latin Americans are not significantly more prone to accepting immigrants than are Europeans or citizens in other areas of the world. However, and that's crucial, in recent years, immigration and asylum applicants have not been very salient issues. So it's not a very controversial issue. And what I show in a paper with Diego Acosta that just came out in IMR is something that we call populist liberalism. So it's not really about immigration. The discourses and the policy change is about immigration, about bashing the United States and the policies of European Union. And based on that and the logic of policy coherence, this feeds back into liberal discourses and within national context, then with the help of civil society and other actors, into the translation of policy change towards liberalness. There also is a new commitment towards human rights, which can be explained by the return of the region to democracy, regional integration, and crucially, the endorsement of these reform projects by individual politicians. Very quickly, in the area of asylum, it's similar. Two things that are different is the lobbying by UNHCR and a legislative history of progressive laws in the area of asylum. Very, very quickly, what are the effects? One thing I want to show is that something we've talked about yesterday and today with some of you is that there's a problem with only using aggregated data on policies. And what I found is that there's also a problem with looking at aggregated data when we look at outcomes, so migrant stocks and asylum seekers. Because sometimes we don't see an effect, depends what we ask. In my case, if I ask, has there been a real paradigm shift? Does this right to migrate apply to all, or are there less or more desired immigrants in Latin America as well? It's more interesting to, so this was asylum. We could talk about Mexico, where there's a slight increase of Central American applications. And then this would be migrant stocks in the cases of Argentina, Ecuador, and Mexico policy liberalization. But when we zoom in now, and I just quickly want to talk about the case of Ecuador. Ecuador in 2008 basically opened its borders and welcomed everyone, did not ask visa or tourist visa policies from any country in the world. And I've got another paper with Kyle Holloway where we show through a difference in difference design that this had a real impact on South-South migration. Not on formerly unrestricted countries, which basically are the wealthy countries in the so-called global north, but people they did not expect. Ecuador did not expect this policy to lead to an increase of Chinese, of people from Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Kenya, or Nigeria. And in fact, it led to, as I would call them, racialized security concerns both within Ecuador and in the region and in the United States. And there was huge pressure to reverse that policy, which happened 6 months later in the case of Chinese, and 2 years later in the case of 9 other African and Asian nationalities. So, has there been a real paradigm shift? I think there has definitely been a philosophical paradigm shift that has translated into policy outputs. And then when we look at implementation and outcomes, it's a real nuanced process. And in the case of Ecuador, this year, a more liberal immigration and asylum law will be passed. So even if there are backlashes, one of the things I think is really interesting from this case of Latin America is the question of whether this shift towards liberalness leaves less room for maneuver to politicians to not follow suit. Because once you say you're going to liberalize, once you actually liberalize policies, you have civil society organizations and migrants activists who can then hold the politicians accountable for what they said and sort of push this liberalization through. Other theoretical implications, what's most important? South North Bar is definitely rejecting it, and this immigration paradox of discourses being more liberal in Latin America than actual policies. I think that is quite interesting. But I'm basically going to skip this and come to the final question, which I would like to discuss with all of you, whether it's feasible and useful to compare these policy cycles within and across countries. And what I've come up with is that the advantages certainly are that you can identify regional trends. If you stay in one policy stage in one country, you cannot do that. You can identify variation and determinants of policy, their implementation and their effects. You can identify circular dependency between policy outputs and outcomes, and interdependency between policy cycles within and across countries. Now, all of this is based on my entire PhD project. So obviously, a disadvantage is that in order to really look at an entire policy cycle, and then maybe even two areas or more countries, you need really large research projects. There is a certain tendency towards descriptiveness because you jump, in my case, between treating policy as dependent and independent variable, and maybe it's just overall too messy, but I look forward to your comments and suggestions. Thank you.